Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast, episode 4. I am your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Seriously, I appreciate it. Today's interview is with author James M. Scott, a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his book Target Tokyo. Yeah, he's a big deal and was willing to talk to me. I don't know why, but I'm eternally grateful. This interview is also very important to me because the original intent for History Nerds United was to have interviews with authors that were just transcribed onto the website. At the end of this talk, James said to me, "This could be a podcast. You should make a podcast. You're not terrible at this." In fact, he was nicer than saying you're not terrible at this, but I'm uncomfortable with praise, so I'm not going to repeat exactly what he said. And after listening to it, I thought, hey, why the heck not? And now we're here. So things turned out pretty well. This was a great conversation, but because it was only my second interview ever and was not planning on putting it out as audio, the audio was a little bit dodgy. We were still figuring out the kinks and all of those things. So you'll hear it sound a little bit different. It's not as good, but trust me, the interview is interesting enough. You'll stop noticing it pretty quickly. James has written a few books. The Pulitzer Prize finalist was Target Tokyo, which he mentions right up front. Also, The Attack on the Liberty and The War Below. He'll touch on those really quickly. The main focus of this interview is on his book Rampage, which had come out in 2018. Great book. I'd read that, and that was the reason I reached out to James. So we talked about that for the most part throughout the podcast. It is about the Battle of Manila in World War II. If you're not familiar, you may have heard about Douglas MacArthur saying something like, "I shall return." That was about him coming back to the Philippines after he was forced out by the Japanese military. It's a really great book. I loved it. And we talk about just how brutal the entire battle was, how James went about making sure that it wasn't overly bloody and gory so that it would completely turn off any reader, while still staying true to the story and making sure that people's voices were heard. It was a great interview. I hope you enjoy it. And now I'm going to shut up and let's get to it. Thank you so much for talking to me. My first question is, how close are any of your books to being a movie? Because, I mean, come on.
It's funny. Of course, I think that's probably what every narrative nonfiction writer wants to have happen, just is sort of have that story picked up. Target Tokyo is actually probably the closest at this point in that it's been optioned by David Von Anken, who's a pretty prolific television director. And so he and his writing partner have sort of broken it down into a potential 10-part miniseries and are trying to basically right now to market it as we speak. So, but Hollywood is a tough business. I mean, you've got so many people out there trying to pitch ideas, pitch projects that it's, there's a lot of competition. So in the meantime, I'm working on book 5 and just trucking along. So.
And that's a question too. You have kind of obviously a genre, and you deal a lot with the military side of things.
Yeah.
But how do you find your book subjects? Is it drinking too much coffee, go down a Wikipedia hole in one night, or is it really trial and error? Like, do you find that you'll have a lot of subjects you get deep into it and find the book just isn't there, or do you think you have a pretty good eye for what can be something pretty big?
Yeah, it's funny. I've sort of learned over the years. Along the way, I mean, I've had books that didn't go anywhere, and my first book was a pretty natural one in that it was the story of my father, and he was in the Navy and was on an American spy ship, and was a program operated by the NSA and the Navy in which they dispatched these old cargo ships that were essentially mobile listing platforms all around the world to sort of eavesdrop on hotspots. USS Pueblo, for instance, which was captured by the North Koreans, was one. And my dad was on the USS Liberty, which was sent to the Middle East in the 1960s during the Six-Day War with Israel and its neighbors. And the Israelis ended up attacking it and killed 34 Americans and wounded more than 170 others. And my dad was the damage control officer. And so I was working as a military reporter at the time for the Post and Courier here in Charleston. And so I was covering, contemporary issues, Iraq, Afghanistan, things like that. And of course, I'm very tight with my dad. And so when I'd be home for holidays, I was like, well, Dad, tell me more about your military. You were involved in this crazy attack. And it grew into oral histories. And those oral histories, my father had said, hey, we've got the 40th anniversary reunion coming up. Why don't you come with me? And so I met a bunch of his shipmates, and and then I lucked up and ended up as a Neiman Fellow up at Harvard, and happened to meet a book agent. And she asked me, she said, "Do you have any ideas?" I said, "Well, my dad was involved in this crazy thing, and I've been kind of researching it." And she's like, "I think that's great." And we sold it 3 months later to Simon and Schuster. And so that started me into this process of writing history books. And so it was a natural progression from journalism, where you're used to doing research, you're used to doing interviews, or you're used to going through archives and courthouses, looking at records. And that translates very easily into doing interviews with historical participants, doing archival research and things like that. And it just so happened, as I finished that book up, I was reading this, and I've always been interested in World War II, but I was reading a book on World War II, the diary of a guy who'd served on a submarine. And my editor at Simon Schuster said, "What are you thinking about next?" And I said, "Well, I'm really interested in these World War II submarines that I've just finished reading a book about." And he said, "Why don't you pick an idea out of that?" And so out of that grew my second idea. And then from then on, kind of everything each project sort of grew into the next project, if you will. And by that, for example, at the end of my book on the submarine war, The War Below, several American submariners are trapped in a prisoner of war camp in Tokyo, and the U.S. begins to firebomb Japanese cities. And so they witnessed the big firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945. And as I was researching that, just for like 3 pages of the book, I was like, wow, this is a fascinating story. I had no idea, just how extensive this firebombing was and how destructive it was. And I said, I need to come back to this. And so here I am now, 3 books later, and that's the subject of the book I'm working on now, just that one raid, that one March 1945 firebombing. And so, it's similarly, kind of my book on Rampage, it's sort of grown out of, looking at Japanese atrocities and things like that had come up at the end of, in the wake of the Doolittle raid. And I read a reference to, how bad the Japanese were. Of course, I read about the Philippines, and I wasn't familiar with it. So I started digging into that. And, next thing you know, I had a book proposal. So you kind of run across these ideas, and I keep a list. I keep a list in my desk drawer of, ideas to come back to and things that interest me. And, for me, really picking a book idea the main thing is it's got to be something that interests me enough where I can see myself spending 3 or 4 years doing nothing but that. Because that's the key thing. You got to wake up every day, no matter what you do, and you've got to be, if not excited, at least willing to go to work that day. And so you've got to pick a topic that, you think can interest you for that amount of time.
And I mean, that's a really, interesting side to me. It sounds like to do this job specifically, you have to be in love with not only the topic, but also the idea of research. I mean, how much, if you write one book and it takes 3 to 4 years, how much of it is research and actual writing? It almost seems like the research is the hard part, then it's all there and you just got to write it.
It is, it very much is. I mean, the research is the bulk of it. And particularly when you're dealing with, information in the tens of thousands of pages range. I mean, like right now I'm sitting here and I've got 80 rolls of digitized microfilm that I'm having to index. And it's just these different bomber commands and wings and groups that I just need to know what the records are. And so I'm literally just spending days and days and days just scrolling through microfilm, breaking them down by different reports and things like that, just to kind of wrap my head around it. For Rampage, I ended up digitizing about 65,000 pages of war crimes records and trial transcripts in the National Archives. And I had to do the same thing there. I mean, really, when you get for these big projects, you're kind of in the information management business as well as being a writer and a historian.
Yeah.
I mean, because you have so much material that if you come across a great quote as you're just in your early stages of researching, and you don't write it down or you don't have a system to track it, you will never find that quote again. And so you really have to develop you have to be highly organized and develop a system to track it. And then, the writing is honestly, in many ways, it's kind of the easy part. At that point, you've got all this material, and then you sort of, break it all down into how can I tell the story. And so even then, as you're writing, you run across, hey, I need to know more about this one specific incident. So you're never 100% done with your research. I mean, I'm writing the book I'm working on now, and I'm getting on a plane Monday to fly to the Air Force Academy for a week. And so I kind of do both simultaneously, because as you write, you also realize the holes in your research.
Yeah.
So, but the research is fun. It's a big historical scavenger hunt.
Yeah, and now I am a follower on your Twitter. So I also know that you're also showing pictures of yourself sitting on the front porch. So it looks like you don't stress yourself out too much at the same time.
Now I am working when I'm sitting on the porch.
Okay.
I've got a great home office. We live in an old house built in the 1800s here in the suburbs of Charleston, and it's an old Victorian house that has a cupola. And when we were redoing the house, we made that into my office in the spring and in the fall, and it's really lovely here. I'll just go sit on the side porch on my laptop and work, and that's a nice treat too. Wearing shorts and flip flops.
Yeah, if only. I'm a government consultant in D.C., so I'm in suits all day. I'd love to be able to. Well, it also seems for you, and again, following you, looking you up, and kind of researching you before I talk to you. Your books, the one with your dad is one thing too, because of course it is your father. But it seems like you, at least during the research and writing, you also get emotionally involved in this, because you seem to do a lot of things afterwards with anybody you can about these things. I see you going to these different commemorations and all of that stuff. Do you find that you just get naturally attracted to these things and you want to stay with it even after the book is done?
Yeah, and that's a big part of it, because you have to remember, when you're telling these stories, it's not like you're writing about the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, where there aren't participants and survivors still around. World War II, even though the numbers are dwindling, they're still veterans. They're still their family members, and whom I often meet and become very friendly with over the course of my research. And so, and that's honestly, that's one of the things I really enjoy. When I'm, getting those, being able to tell those stories, because history, and it's something I really try to do in my work. I think the best history is when you really focus on ordinary people in extraordinary situations. Whether it's one of those young crew members who's never been in combat flying on the Doolittle raid, or whether it's a young boy caught in an internment camp in the Philippines, or a Filipino trying to get away from the Japanese during the Battle of Manila. It's sort of those human stories. That I think is one of the most compelling things. When you're writing a story like that, your readers want to have an emotional connection to the events that you're telling. And the best way for them to have that is for them to sort of empathize with these individuals and these characters. And so a lot of history, can be dry, and it can be full of numbers and how many divisions and tanks and carriers and things like that. But when you can ground history in individuals, it's so much stronger and more powerful. I compare it to feeding vegetables to my children. If I put cheese on broccoli, they will eat it because they don't realize they're getting something healthy underneath the cheese. If you can tell history in a way in which people can connect with the events and the people, they don't realize that they're learning something, and it becomes an enjoyable event, not something that they remember from high school when they just had to memorize, a bunch of numbers and dates and things like that. So, and I think it's a big part, because history at the end of the day is made by people. And if you look at all the stories that I've done, they all tend to focus often on individuals. Rampage, yes, there's Yamasha and there is MacArthur, but if you really look at it, the spotlight tends to be on several American families who are trapped in Santo Tomas and several Filipino families who are outside in the city. And they're the people I come back to over and over again. I just think that's such an important part of history, is connecting people. As a result of that, I've gotten to know lots of the families of the Doolittle Raiders. And, when I was working on the book, several of them were still alive. Same thing with the Philippines. When I was over there doing research, it's just, that's a really great part of it, having those connections and having those opportunities to meet with the participants.
And you really do a good job with that. It's one of the things that I really liked about Rampage is, going to West Point, I also know the military science side. And you can really lose your audience if you get too far into the military science side. And you also really pulled me in. You had one anecdote in there. I'm a former Army tanker. So, we have strange senses of humor, and we react strangely in stressful situations. And you have that one anecdote about the people in the prison hearing an American tank come through and then hearing them say, "Oh, damn it, we're on the wrong street. We got to go over one." And then closing up the door. And I just sat there and I'm like, you get it. From my perspective, that's just, I can see myself going, oh, damn it, you're in the middle of a war zone, but it's like, oh, we're on the wrong street. We got to go over one.
Yeah, exactly. Those maps just weren't quite what they were cut out to be. So, yeah, I mean, that's just an important part of it, And I'll say, I mean, Rampage is one where, like, I could have done a whole book looking at sort of, how the cavalry and the infantry divided up the city and, breaking down how they advanced each day. But that wasn't the story I wanted to tell. I mean, the story I wanted to tell was what happened to that city and what happened to those people. Because at the end of the day, 100 civilians died for every one U.S. soldier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a battle that really was born on the backs of that city's population. And so I felt like the spotlight should be more on the civilians in the city than it should be on the Americans and even to some extent the Japanese. So that that was kind of the decision to sort of put the spotlight where it landed.
And that's reading stuff like that, especially when you're reading about the Pacific. Something I've always wondered. I don't know if you have an official stance on this. It seems like the Japanese atrocities are very much lost to history almost, where, I mean, the History Channel is basically all Nazis. Whereas you have the Japanese did some just absolutely atrocious stuff, but it seems not to be part of the narrative when you talk about World War II.
No, it's not. And the Pacific War in general doesn't get the attention that the European theater does. And I mean, there are probably about 1,000 books done on D-Day, for example. And this is the first sort of major American book on the Battle of Manila. I mean, how can this be, the first time it's really been addressed here when you're dealing with, the Philippines and Manila, which was a former U.S. colony, a city built to look just like an American city in Asia, which we had close business, economic, and cultural ties. Then it's the only urban battle of the Pacific War. And it leads to 100,000 civilian deaths. In some of the worst atrocities of World War II, and yet people have no idea. And yet, as you said, I mean, there's been so much more done on the European theater, but I think it has much more to do with sort of, America has long looked, when we look outside of our shores, we look across towards Europe, and that has historically been the case. I think that's changing now. Immigration patterns and things like that have resulted in a much greater emphasis on what's going on in Asia. And so you are starting to see more and more books coming out of the Pacific theater. But there's still a lot of material out there left to mine. I will tell you that for someone like myself who's his focus is on the Pacific War, in some ways that's great because there are a lot of stories out there that haven't been covered. I mean, I cannot imagine trying to write a book on D-Day right now. Just to get caught up on the existing literature. So when the nice thing is when I'm doing something like Rampages, there's really, there's a lot of books that have been done in the Philippines, and then I read those, I got copies of those, but you can find those stories and tell them and have a fresh voice, fresh audience, fresh idea to present.
Yeah, and then another part of Rampage, which I really liked, and you could tell me if you meant to paint this portrait, because I am a West Pointer, so I knew about him well before this, but Douglas MacArthur is one of those special people that seems to be supremely gifted, but also a very arrogant jerk in a lot of different ways, too. He's one of those dichotomies of, depending on who you're talking to, they'll hold him up as this god of war, but then you see these other side of things, and you're like, well, he's not as good as everybody makes him out to be in every situation.
Yeah. MacArthur's one of those. I mean, like I said, D. Clayton James did basically spent his entire life researching MacArthur, and he did his 3-volume history on him. And so, I mean, you can, and so have others. I mean, William Manchester wrote an 800-page book on him. I mean, MacArthur. And in this, he of course is a prominent figure in the book, but it wasn't as much about him. But MacArthur's one of those really interesting people, and the great thing about being, I'm 44 years old, so I grew up after MacArthur had died and all that. So my whole impressions of MacArthur don't come from the time in which he lived and which people had sort of made up their minds. It really comes to just looking at him through history, and I see both sides of him. I mean, there were parts of MacArthur that were that were really pretty visionary, and parts of MacArthur that, it's almost juvenile behavior. That's also what makes him really interesting and what makes him really human. And when you're writing about stories like, characters and things like that, you want somebody like MacArthur because he comes off the page. I mean, he would sit around, and I mentioned this in Rampage, he would talk about himself in meetings in the third person. He would say things like, MacArthur thinks we should do this. And how bizarre is that? I mean, even Eisenhower said, it was really odd at first, but you somehow weirdly got used to it. So he had these crazy quirks and things like that. But, in this case, in probably one of the biggest flaws of MacArthur was he had this inability to learn from his mistakes. And you saw them crop up again and again. I mean, like what happened in Manila, his failure to appreciate that the Japanese were digging in and were preparing for this urban fight really shows up again just, a few years later in Korea when he's like, the Chinese are never going to come across and get involved in this war. And, meanwhile, 300,000 of them are pouring into Korea, And so he had this inability, to learn. And I think today's military doesn't tolerate that. You don't get a second chance.
No.
But the fascinating thing, too, about the MacArthurs is that if you look at father and son, I mean, they, because people forget his father had also been, a Medal of Honor recipient, a Civil War hero and things like that. I mean, these two, father and son, I mean, they span literally every American conflict from the Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and Korea. I mean, they an entire century of warfare. And both of them also played huge roles in warfare in the Philippines. MacArthur's dad was there during the Spanish-American War and also the Philippine-American War, which was a very destructive period of history for the Philippines. And then his son comes back and, ultimately is there during the Battle of Manila, which totally destroys Manila. So you see this father and son, they're almost bookends of this American colonial experience in the Philippines. That I think is something that a lot of people probably don't realize. And, but MacArthur is he's an interesting guy. I mean, the challenge with MacArthur, particularly in a book like this, when you're not writing it totally about MacArthur, is how much of him to include versus how much to leave out.
Yeah.
You could make a book all about him.
Yeah, to me, he's always, him and Patton are kind of two sides of the same coin, just these extremely gifted people, but also the egos are outside, whereas you have Eisenhower, who I think is the exact opposite, somebody who maybe, wasn't as gifted, but probably was, but also could learn and didn't have to have that spotlight and could let other people, shine without him trying to drag in that credit or things like that.
Yeah, and Chester Nimitz was the same way. I mean, just this real mild-mannered guy who, runs the entire Navy's war in the Pacific, does a brilliant job. Then at the end of his life, destroys all his personal records because it wasn't about him.
Yeah,
it was about the entire Navy, and so you just and you can't compare and contrast him just the same way with Patton and MacArthur to someone like Bull Halsey. These crazy, colorful characters, and you kind of had that. One of the things too, I think that's worth noting with MacArthur in Manila, and one of the things I tried to bring out in the story was he had a huge personal attachment to this city, and he'd done 4 deployments there, served over there 4 different times. He'd met his wife there. His mother had died there. His son was born there. He had this huge personal attachment to the Philippines, and for him, and his home was there, and ultimately destroyed during that battle. And so when you go to the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, there are really no artifacts from his family before 1945 because everything was destroyed inside that house. So, there is a big personal connection between him and Manila and the Battle of Manila, so.
And it's really interesting because you almost touched on it. Was one of the big things I wanted to ask was, how hard it was to edit even just Rampage because, it's a fantastic book, but like you had mentioned before, it's really dark book. I mean, there were times where, when you write about dark times in history, you don't want your book to be, I couldn't put it down because I don't think you're doing service to it. Like with Rampage, there's a couple times I'm like, I'm going to need a break for a little bit because it's overwhelming just the amount of violence and just terrible things happening where you just have to say, it's important that it's on the page, but at the same time, you have to kind of almost space yourself out from it. Like, you said you had to leave out even more. Was there just a lot to edit out?
I want to be as complete and thorough as possible. And there were 27 major atrocities inside Manila that the U.S. government documented. Of course, there were more even beyond that. Those were the ones that we documented. And so when I was writing the book, my initial instincts were I need to make sure I include all of them. And so I did. And so my editor had read the book and the first draft of it. He came back. He said, "Man, it's too grisly. It's too grim, and it's going to be you're going to turn readers off." And so I went back in and I cut 3 chapters of the atrocities out. And they're not totally out, but they're just broken down and sort of paraphrased, mentioning that way. But they're not covered in the level of detail that the others are. And after that, my editor was like, much happier with it. But I think in retrospect, I probably should have cut another chapter or 2 out even, because it is, and this is something my editor and I actually debated. He disagreed. He said, no, it's still overwhelming, but it was an overwhelming battle. And you want the reader to end the book to feel exhaustion and feel that sense of being overwhelmed by the violence, because that's what it was like. Mm-hmm. And if you can leave the reader that way, then they get a sense that, God, it was awful. I mean, you can't, it has that emotional effect. And I see his point on that. I still, from a readability standpoint, I think we may have been better off to maybe take at least one more chapter out just to speed you through those scenes. Because it's about a 75 section of the book in the middle. It's just pretty blood-soaked. I did a book tour in the Philippines in February. And I had people in the Philippines were like, you didn't include my dad's massacre in here. And, you left out this other atrocity. And so the American audiences tend to be more like, it's just too much blood, whereas the Philippine audience, who survived it, and who has, and who pretty much every family there knows somebody that suffered through this time period, they want more. So, it's kind of, I guess you cannot make everybody totally happy on that, but but it's a tough balance. It really is.
Yep.
Particularly coming off of a book like The Doolittle Raid, which is, a very upbeat story of American ingenuity and resourcefulness and sort of this dark period in our history, and coming up with this sort of daring mission that, is successful. And then you go to Rampage, which, even though we win the battle, everyone loses because, everything's destroyed in the end. The buildings, the city, the lives, the livelihoods. So it's a tough one.
And now, so that's a good segue, because you were a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Mm-hmm. How much did you geek out when you found out? Or are you one of those cool guys like, awards are nice, but the book was enough?
No, I was pretty stunned by it, to be honest with you. My editor had said, hey, we're going to submit Target Tokyo for a bunch of different awards. And publishers do that every year. And so, or every book, they submit them. And so I hadn't really thought much more about it. And I was at home one day in the afternoon, and I was helping my daughter with her homework, and my cell phone just started beeping repeatedly. And I looked down, there was all these Twitter alerts that popped up. It was like 40 emails that come in saying that. I was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And so I read one of them from a friend of mine. He said, well, I guess finalist is just as good as being a winner. And I'm like, what's he talking about? Then there was one from my editor mentioning it. So, and I'll be honest, I was totally stunned. I had no idea. I was totally caught off guard. I mean, it came in totally out of the blue, like after one Tuesday or Monday afternoon. But no, it's super cool. It's a super big honor. I mean, I was just blown away by it all. And very appreciative of the Pulitzer judges and board and all that.
Yeah, so obviously, you know what you're doing. Is there anything that you would tell your younger self right before your first book, Tactical Liberty, that you wish you could have told the younger you now so you didn't have to learn it the hard way?
Gosh, I don't know. It's such writing a book, and see, I'd come from journalism. So I'd come from writing newspaper articles over to writing books. And so for me, it was a big learning process of trying to figure out how to go from writing a story in 1,000 words to writing one over, 100,000 words. What I would tell people most is that storytelling is the most important element of it. If you can tell a good story and you can bring these characters back alive, then you can, people can engage once again with these stories that, that aren't otherwise out there. And we live in a world, I'll tell you the challenge we live in, a world where, and I see it with my own two kids, you've got unlimited entertainment options. You've got Netflix, you've got Amazon Prime, you've got Hulu, you've got Facebook, you've got Twitter, you've got Instagram. And getting people to engage with good old-fashioned books is hard, and it's a challenge. And so the way to do that is to have to tell a good story, and to bring people into it that way. So I think what I would tell people is, spend a lot of time at the forefront of your idea. If you've got an idea for a book, and really think about how you're going to map that book out, and how there's going to be a dramatic, sort of arc, if you will, to pull people through 300 pages, and who are going to be the good characters that you can flash out, that you can create attachment to and emotional connection for with your readers. Because, a good history book's a lot like a novel. It can be. And that's what you want.
Yeah. And you did mention other media. Will you admit to, when you're not writing, are you watching trashy TV? And will you tell me what those shows are?
Yeah, totally. I love Netflix. I love Amazon Prime. So I love the storytelling that we're seeing on television these days. These long form. Breaking Bad, to me, was one of the best television shows ever made.
Absolutely.
And it's a writer's show. I mean, from the very beginning to the very end, there's not a wasted word in it. And the character development. And so I really appreciate that, because so much of they're different media forms, but it still goes back to the same thing, which is storytelling and character. And that's what so drives, any good product, whether it's fiction, whether it's, like Breaking Bad, or whether it's nonfiction. And if you read other good nonfiction writers, I read Hampton Sides' stuff. I love Eric Larson's stuff, there's just so many David Grann's stuff. If you really look at what makes those stories so good is the character development and the storylines, and you can always find, history is one of those things, it's constantly moving. It's like a freeway, it's just filled with cars. But you want to be able to figure out, where can I jump on and ride for a little while and get off, and make it so that it has this good narrative arc of, conflict and tension that builds up to some sort of resolution.
And we're seeing that too with a lot of World War II espionage stuff, because it's starting to kind of come out. They're starting to declassify things, and you're just seeing this glut of them coming out. But jumping back to the TV stuff too, I absolutely agree with what you can see on TV. I read, I don't know if you've been able to read Midnight in Chernobyl. I
haven't read it, but I watched the HBO show. Yeah, which was amazing.
And I hate to be that guy. The book is so much better, of course, because it's all there. But even the TV show, I'm sitting there and I'm talking to people about it afterwards. And of course, I'm a history nerd, so they're like, "Did that happen?" I'm like, "That happened." And I think what you're starting to see is, I always hated watching anything that was historically based that was just completely stupid. And it seems like people are figuring out how to write the story within the history, and figuring out, I might have to shorten this here, and I might have to change this a little bit here, but still keeping kind of the spine of the history, so that you can go back and say, this happened and this really happened. And history is amazing in and of itself. You just have to figure out how to fit it in a 2 or 3 hour block.
Yeah, and the challenge for them too, they want to make characters into composites and things like that, and because you're dealing in like with a Hollywood film in just a much more limited space of only having about 90 minutes to 100 minutes. With a miniseries, you can do more of that. There's some people out there who get really mad when things aren't 100% perfect in the way they were, and I don't tend to be as rough on films for that. I think anytime you can get people to engage with history is good. Because history is so important, and it plays such an important role in our culture, who we are, where we came from, same with the rest of the world, and we live in a world where everybody else wants to watch Marvel and these superheroes and things like that. So if you can get people to engage with history, even if it's not perfect history, it's still a good step.
Which I'm usually fine, as long as it's not too it's 2 Mel Gibson movies that still drive me nuts. The Patriot and Braveheart are so freaking far off the mark. It drives me absolutely insane. Because a lot of the things you see there, you're like, if you just changed this a little bit, you could have stayed to the history and had everything you wanted.
Yeah.
but you had to make it this and you had to make it this, and you really compromised what you're trying to do there.
Yeah, no, and you're right about that. I mean, and I agree. You don't want to go too far in one direction, but at the same time, I mean, I was reading the Hotel Mumbai, the film that came out this year. I watched it on the airplane not too long ago. I thought it was a really well done film, and it really explored something that for us here in the U.S. was just something we saw a little bit on CNN and whatnot. But a couple of the characters in it were composites of other characters. Some people online had gotten upset about that. Because I always go, and this is what other people should probably do, is I always go with the truth in. You can go to these web pages like, what's the truth in reality on these films, things like that. Because I do want to know the differences. Yeah. And a lot of people don't necessarily do that. And so there was some online chatter about it. And I thought in the overall scheme of things, making a couple of characters into a composite, like I get that. I mean, it's Hollywood is a different type of, it's a different animal. They tell stories differently. And but I'm not as, like I said, not quite as persnickety, I guess, as some are. I think if you can, and I'm raising two kids right now, 10 and 12 years old. And so I struggle with keeping them interested in history with all the other things out there. And, and I've taken my kids, national parks. I took them last year. We took them to Hawaii. I took them to Pearl Harbor, walked them, we spent a whole day there. So they get a little bit more of a, focus on it than probably some kids do. But it's hard. It's hard to engage children these days with all the other distractions out there. And, to really be interested in these kinds of stories. So, but, World War II, I will say, I'm so pleased. I was just watching the trailer yesterday for the new Terrence Malick film. That's getting ready to come out. You still see World War II still shows up. If you look at, Dunkirk, Darkest Hour, Hacksaw Ridge, there's a new film on Midway getting ready to come out. Yeah. There still remains a strong pop culture, contemporary interest in these stories that are, 75 years old. So that's positive.
Listen, whenever you can kill a Nazi, it's going to be money at the bank. You know what I mean?
They call it the Hitler Channel because that's pretty much so much what they do. So.
Yes. It was a bit of a letdown after a couple of years in History Channel. I'm like, oh, it's just Hitler again. Okay. All right.
Like, what more can you say?
Yeah. He's really, really bad. We get it. I find, especially for you, you're really active on Twitter, which, not a lot of authors really. Is it something do you enjoy the social media aspect? I know from my website, I absolutely hate having to deal with it and having, 2 or 3 things here and I'm going to format it here and things like that. But you kind of seem to lean into it. Do you enjoy it?
At times, I mean, and I'll go long periods of time without engaging on social media too. So it kind of goes both ways. I mean, you're always in the way I look at it, like, and I need to actually be better about this. What happens is when I finish a book and I've got a little more downtime, I tend to be more engaged. But like when I'm neck deep in research, it kind of sort of falls off the radar. For instance, like with Rampage, I scanned in at the National Archives. I spent an entire week there. I scanned in 530 images from the Battle of Manila, which is way more than we could ever use in a book. I think we ended up using about 87 images in the book. So all those extra images are a great way to connect with readers and things like that is to just throw them out on social media. Just put the cut line and throw it out there. And, here's another image from the Battle of Manila. And so it's a great way to kind of keep sharing history. Early on in the process, my focus was always on the writing and the textual elements of the book. But like with Rampage and with the Doolittle book, I really was, the amount of great visuals that are out there and how to engage with readers through photographs and even video and through social media. I think it's all good. And people want that. Readers want to know, they finish a good book and, you finish a good book, you want to know more. You want to see the stuff that didn't make it in. Or you want to see those extra photos. So, you always gather way more than you're ever going to use in a book. And so it's a good way to kind of disseminate some of it.
And I'm going to ask one last question from you because, I'm sure the readers are going to want to know. Can you confirm that gin and tonic with homegrown limes is your favorite drink?
Oh, it totally is. And the homegrown limes make it. And I'll tell you, there's I have 4 lime bushes.
Really?
I got into my mother had a lime bush for years and still does. And so years ago, I never had one, and I finally plucked one off and made a drink with it. And there's a different level of spiciness to a homegrown lime. And so this was probably about 8 or 9 years ago. So I got my first lime bush. And they take a few years before they start producing limes. So, I planted it, and they're really low maintenance. You water them once a week, and it just sits there. And so then, like, my mother-in-law gave me another one, and then I picked up another one somewhere, and then my son and I planted one from a seed. So, like, suddenly I now have 4 of them. And but it really does make a difference. And it's funny because a lot of my friends, I live in South Carolina. It's hot here. Gin and tonics are a popular summertime drink. When you're down in Charleston sometime, you have to come over. We'll sit on my porch.
Listen, I'll hold you to it.
Absolutely.
I spent some of my time in the military in Fort Benning, Georgia. So it's very funny. I come from a northeastern family in New York, and I live in Virginia now. But it's very funny kind of explaining that type of humidity to somebody who hasn't been in the South in July. Just kind of explain. I always used to say, I'm like, I'd rather go back to the Iraq heat because it was at least dry.
Yeah. It's funny. I was in the Philippines on one of my trips, and so everybody kept asking me, "It's like, is it too hot for you here?" And I was like, "This is just like Charleston, 90 degrees and 90% humidity. I do that 6 months out of the year."
Yeah, I would definitely need a gin and tonic if I came back down there.
Well, come to my porch. I'll have one for you.
Sounds good.
All right, that is it for episode 4. Thank you so much, James, for coming on. Everybody, History Nerds United, website, the podcast, please listen, like, follow, do whatever you can to support us. Greatly appreciate you listening today. I did get some feedback. In case you were wondering, if you love the music you hear on here, Ghost Rodents. The Ghost Rodents out of New Jersey. Great band. Go to their website, listen to their music. They're pretty awesome, right? Anyway, have a great end of the year. We will see you in January.